Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Conflicts Leading to Revolution Part 2. In our last video, we stopped at the Boston Massacre, and you most likely wrote this down in your note sheet, but I really didn't dig into what all happened, okay? So the story that you've been told is probably different from what actually occurred and what is historically accurate, okay? So, the Boston Massacre happens in 1770. We are 6 years from full-out revolution and goodbye to Britain. Okay, so what happens is it's cold, it's winter in Boston, and we know from our previous lessons that Boston is in New England and Massachusetts, so it is cold as heck. There's most likely snow on the ground, just to consider. Additionally, there is no real sanitation system in large cities at this point until, oh gosh, the mid-1800s, late 1800s, if that. So everybody's trash and everybody's excrement just lays in the street. Nasty, okay? Gross. So, that being said, at the end of the night, like last call happens, people start coming out of the taverns. They are drunk as all get out, okay? Can barely stand up. And some people, when they get intoxicated, are very angry humans, okay? And so, this particular set of colonists were real just mad, looking for a fight. And around the corner come 12 British soldiers patrolling the streets, because at this point, the military presence in Boston has been ramped up, because Boston has been a center for kind of chaos and rebellion so far. And so, in order to kind of squash that, the king has sent some extra troops over here with their little red coats and little tri-cornered hats. So they're walking around the corner, and these colonists are like, we're not having none of this today. They start picking up trash, they make snowballs, and they start hurling them at these British soldiers. And you know good and well, if there is some type of conflict or some type of fight, humans love to just watch the chaos unfold. So a big crowd has gathered, everybody's intoxicated, everybody's wild, okay? There's like 200 to 300 people in this big old mob, and 12 little dinky soldiers with their little rifles with their bayonets on the end. So eventually this crowd gets so large that the soldiers, in their infinite wisdom, decide the best way to disperse this crowd and get everybody to go home is just to shoot directly into the crowd. So they end up doing so and kill 5 people, including a newly freed man named, what is that boy's name? Crispus Attucks. That's what it is. His name was Crispus Attucks, and he was a newly freed African American man. And so that was not great. You could arguably say this is the first instance of police brutality in the colonies that was recorded and like seriously considered. So at this point, the colonists now see this as a direct act of treason. This is a direct act of war. You have shot and killed and murdered in the street 5 people that you are supposed to be protecting. So these 12 soldiers go on trial. Can you guess how many of them got convicted of murder in the first degree? If you answered 0 to that previous question, you would be correct. Not nary one of them got in trouble for this. Okay, so there's that. The result of this massacre... Quit beeping at me. It happens every time. Okay, so Paul Revere draws this little cartoon, and you should probably pay attention to this because you may or may not see it. I don't know, maybe on like a test somewhere. Just saying. This particular drawing of that does not indicate that they were completely surrounded on all sides by colonists. This just shows the British being a firing squad. It also looks like it's during the day. This did not occur during the day. It occurred at night. The top half of this cartoon that I have mistakenly cropped has a little moon in the corner to signify that it is at night. But this is just straight up propaganda. This is not how the event went down. However, this is the portrayal that everybody in the colony sees because this is the cartoon that winds up in the newspaper. Okay? And eventually, word travels all around Boston and New England, all the way down into the southern colonies. And the result of this is that the colonies rally together and are beginning to unite. You cannot defeat an enemy if you are in a whole bunch of separate, scattered pieces. You have to be one solid unit. You've got a better chance of beating your enemy that way. So, the colonies begin to do so. Now, let's get into it. The next one is the Tea Act that happens 3 years later in 1773. So before we got into the Boston Massacre, we had the Townshend Acts, or the tax on luxury goods that pretty much only affects rich people. Now, rich people have a lot of power and have a lot of connections. And so the king really did not think that tax through, and Parliament did not think that tax through, because if they piss off their allies, which are rich people, there's a strong chance that the rebellion is going to keep going. So like, you know what? We're going to repeal or take back the tax on all these goods except for tea. Because guess who owns the tea company? The king. And that is the only tea company that anybody is allowed to buy tea from in the colonies. So in order to help himself, he places a tax on a good that he knows he can drive the price up on, because he has a monopoly. If he has the only tea company and you can't buy it from not nary another person except for King George III, he's going to make a lot of money off of that. All right. Oh, sad. Okay, and then the next is the Boston Tea Party. So the Townshend Acts were a British reaction to the colonists being like, we are not having this whole let's tax luxury goods thing. And then the colonists react to the British people's reaction. So British officials come steaming into Boston Harbor. Well, not steaming in. Come rolling in with their little wooden boats to Boston Harbor with their $3 million worth of tea. Okay? And their 3 big old ships with a huge tax on them. And the colonists are like, I don't know who you think is going to buy this tea, but it ain't us. Okay? Couldn't be us. Surely not. Please go ahead and take this back. And the British people are like, we just got out of a 2-month journey to get over here with this tea. You're going to buy this blasted tea from us. And the colonists are like, you thought. So eventually, during the day, some of the Founding Fathers, some of the Sons of Liberty, the ones who are the Colonial Terror Squad, they end up dumping 3 ships full of tea, the equivalent of $3 million worth of tea, into the Boston Harbor. They also foolishly dress as Native Americans to be like, we were here first, even though they weren't. So, anywho, the king, when he realizes that $3 million worth of his tea has just been dumped in the harbor, he's already in debt. He cannot afford that. That is not how it works. He gets real pissed off at them, and he and Parliament are like, y'all not going to behave this way. We are shutting your whole operation down. They put the whole city of Boston on straight up military lockdown. Nobody in, nobody out, unless you have specific papers from the king himself to move about your business. Okay? So they closed down the Boston port. Now, if you remember back to our colonial regions when we talked about Boston being in New England and being a shipping economy, if they're not allowed to trade out of Boston port, there's going to be a lot of people out of work in Boston, and that is not good for the colonial economy. So, in order to punish the Tea Party squad, they just put the whole city on lockdown. Okay? They also foolishly take away self-government in Massachusetts. Let's think about this. All the way back to the Pilgrims, y'all, in 1620. They have had self-government since 1620. 154 years of voting for their own representatives. Okay? And now all of a sudden, people in Massachusetts cannot vote. Specifically, land-owning white men cannot vote. And they get real mad about their rights. Okay? As founding fathers or just general colonial people. They are not pleased about this. This is called the Intolerable Acts, or the Intolerable Act by colonists. However, British people call it the Coercive Act, because they're like, we're just going to try and bribe you into doing the right thing. And the British people are like, and the colonists are like, don't think so. In reaction to this, the Founding Fathers finally decide it's time to have a meeting. Okay? And they do so. And this is called the First Continental Congress. Alright? Congress, if it's a lowercase c, is just a squad of people getting together talking about laws. Okay? This happens 2 years before full-on revolution. Okay? And representatives from all colonies except Georgia meet in Philly. Why do you think people from Georgia are not there? Hope you know, there's a question coming up. If you're like, because they're prisoners in Georgia, you'd be correct, okay? They all meet in Philadelphia. Hint, Philadelphia is the first capital of the United States. It was New York for a little bit, and then it went back to Philly. It was complicated. All right, so they send this little letter. Please don't write this whole thing down in your notes, because it's going to take you forever. Just say, this is a we can do what we want letter. That's literally what it is, okay? This is a declaration of grievances, problems that you have, and the rights that you have to King George III. And they say, you know what? We have the right to run our own affairs because you have been leaving us alone over here for 150 years, and now you want to meddle in our business, and we're not having it. Okay? Here's the thing. They do not declare independence yet. It is too early. They're not mad enough. Okay? So it takes them a couple more issues in order to do so. Again, this is the first time that they have met up together. Before they leave as a squad, the Founding Fathers, these 55 old white men in a room, say, if anything big happens, we will have another meeting. Well, something big did happen, the beginning of a whole war. Okay, this happens with the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the following year. Okay, this is the beginning of the American Revolution. Okay, these two little battles in Lexington and Concord, people say, if you're like actually from Massachusetts, you pronounce it Concord. I don't know why, don't ask me. Okay, and they call this the shot heard round the world. Obviously, you can't really hear the shot. Okay, that's not a thing. However, this was considered to be the beginning of the American Revolution because actual bullets start flying. Really, it's musket balls, but whatever. Okay, so a war is a big enough reason to have a second meeting because at this point, if we're in a full-on war with Great Britain, we are no longer part of their government. Okay, if your government turns on you and is literally shooting you in the face, you should probably not listen to that government any longer. Just a thought. Okay, so that's enough of that. And then they have a second meeting, the Second Continental Congress, a few months after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, okay, or Concord, however you want to say it, in 1775. Eventually, they rewrite like 43 separate times the Declaration of Independence, and eventually they sign it, okay? Now, not every founding father in the room is going to agree with splitting up with England, but that's what happens. These 55 old white men, give or take a few if they're sick or whatever, they become the group that governs the colonies during the war, okay? And they end up becoming referred to as the Founding Fathers, okay? Now let's speak a little more about the people who did not agree with the Declaration of Independence. So our good pal John Dickinson in 1775 is like, listen, I don't think we need to get all the way broken up with Great Britain. I'm unsure that's a thing that we need to do. We don't really know how to run a government. We don't know what we're doing. I don't trust us. We can't trade with Great Britain anymore if we piss them off, and we can't afford to do that. So let's not. So he writes this little letter called the Olive Branch Petition. And this is a biblical reference because at the end of, if you have heard of the Bible story of Noah, God floods the earth because people are acting foolish, and Noah takes himself and his wife and his kids and 2 of every animal, including mosquitoes and roaches somehow, and drives around in his boat for 40 days and 40 nights while it's raining. And eventually God says, I'm going to grant you an olive branch, and you're going to be able to see a tree at the end of this flood when I have let the waters come back that will give you some semblance of peace. Okay, so an olive branch is a symbol of peace. So John Dickinson writes this little, we can work it out letter. He's the type of person that if he is in a toxic relationship, he's going to keep going back and be like, but we really love each other. No, John, you don't. Okay? They want to reconcile or like make amends or like work it out with the king. But pretty much everybody else is like, no thanks. We'll skip Patrick Henry for now. All right, and Thomas Paine, who lives in Great Britain, writes in the same year this pamphlet called Common Sense. Okay, and he lives in Britain and is speaking out against the king while there. All right, and he also speaks out so loudly that he has to run away to France in order to get away from being killed by the king. Because France is like, we don't like him either. You can come live here. That's fine. So Thomas Paine writes his little pamphlet that supports independence from Britain. And eventually we sign the good old Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is our official breakup letter with England, and it was actually written down physically by Thomas Jefferson. Okay? Dun 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 dun. Memes. All right. And that has been Conflict Leading to the Revolution, Part 2.